Okay, so the Book of Ben Sira, also known as Ecclesiasticus, which is the church's book for some reason or other, is the longest of the wisdom books. In all truth, I would not say that it's the best. It's a very interesting book if you're interested in social history and interested in a kind of snapshot of Judaism at a particular time. Which is to say roughly about 200 years before Christ, or a little bit later than that. We know when this book was written because there is a preface to it. There's a preface to the Greek translation of it. And it was written by the man's grandson. And he refers to the author, to the sage, Ben Sira himself, as my grandpa Jesus. Got to be one of the great lines in scripture, I think. And he says that his grandpa, many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that follow them. That's interesting because it means that in the early 2nd century BC, scripture was basically the law and the prophets. Even in the New Testament, it's still often just the law and the prophets, sometimes with the Psalms added. But you didn't have most of what we call the writings, or at least they didn't have the same status at that time. And according to the grandson, his grandpa Jesus had acquired considerable proficiency in these books and was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom. In other words, he figured, I can do this too. He wanted to write a book that would also be accepted as scripture, as authoritative writing. And, he pulled it off to a degree. Now, it wasn't included in the Hebrew Bible. Why? Now, you might like to think that it's because of what he said about women, but don't believe it. The reason it wasn't included in the Hebrew Bible, I think, was just that it was relatively late. And, people knew who the author was. A lot of the wisdom books, Job, nobody really knows who wrote it. Proverbs and Koheleth even were presented as writings of Solomon. But Ben Sira is actually presented as a writing of a man who lived in Jerusalem about 200 BC. And so that, I think, is why he didn't quite make it into the canon of Hebrew scripture. But the book was very popular and it circulated with other writings. In the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, you have a much bigger collection of scriptures. That is why we have a difference between the Catholic canon and the Protestant canon. The Protestant canon is essentially the same as the Hebrew canon for the Hebrew Bible. But the Catholic canon includes several books that were only preserved in Greek. Now, Ben Sira is kind of exceptional because even though it's only fully preserved in Greek, a lot of it was preserved in Hebrew. And you get it quoted by the rabbis, and you get fragments of it found not quite in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in scrolls found by the Dead Sea at Masada. There are fragments of Ben Sira. So this was probably the book of the books that didn't make it into the canon of the Hebrew Bible. This was the one that was closest to the edge. And, there was always a fuzzy edge to the canon. It was never altogether clear which books should be in and which books should not. So Ben Sira, as I say, then almost pulled it up. We know when it was written because his grandson tells us that he came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes, and we know when that was. That was about 117 BCE, and we figure his grandfather would have lived maybe 70 years before that somewhere, but somewhere between 200 and the Maccabean Revolt, which was about 168. So it's a much more situated book.